Welcome to Downey High School's online history class. I'm your instructor, Ms. Lojano, and today we're going to be talking about imperialism in the United States. So imperialism is a movement that gets going in the US between 1890 and 1920. And at the bottom of this screen, you can see a definition for imperialism. It says when a stronger country exerts influence over other less developed countries through political, economic, or military means. So essentially what that looks like is a larger industrial country will go and either take over or send their military into or use economic means to exert influence in a smaller, less developed country. So you can see in the picture, this is the United States moving into a period where we're essentially taking over or exerting our influence in many more parts of the world. Okay, now before we get into the origins of imperialism, we want to review where we are on the timeline. So if you look at the top, at the very top, you'll see this is the period that or the two periods that we studied before break. Industrialization, immigration, and urbanization goes from 1870 to 1920. And as you recall, that is when factories grew in the United States exponentially, and the United States becomes this industrial power. Okay, now, what we talked about next was how that industrialization, immigration, and urbanization created problems at home, like bad housing and child labor and all of that. And that led to the progressive era, 30 years later, 1900 to 1920, where they're trying to solve all those problems. Okay, meanwhile, imperialism is going at the same time. Okay, so you'll notice imperialism actually starts earlier. It starts in the 1890s. It only takes about 20 years for US factories to produce so many goods. We need more places to sell them to. And so that is going to drive the US out into the world, trying to find countries to buy our stuff, essentially. And that is going to go from 1890 to 1920. So you can see these are the three presidents that we talked about under the progressives, Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. And they are also the presidents during the imperialism era, right? So progressivism is what's happening at home. Imperialism is what's happening abroad. And you can see some of the big events in imperialism listed on here. We're going to pick up Hawaii during this time. We'll go to war with Spain and pick up some territory. The U.S. gets the Panama Canal. We're going to intervene in the Mexican Revolution. And then the United States is going to join World War I. So all of that is going down during the imperialism era. All right, so let's talk about some of the origins of imperialism. Why does the United States decide that this is the moment where we should enter the world scene and start exerting influence? And the major reason is because of industrialization and trade. So essentially what happened, as I mentioned before, when factories exploded, is we made too many clothes, right? They were like, who is going to buy all of this stuff? There's not enough buyers in America. And so we need markets for surplus industrial goods. By markets, we mean people to sell to. And so if you look down at this map, you can see on this map, there is a large country that hasn't industrialized yet. That's right, China. And we're like, hey, lots of people to buy our shoes, right? So this is what we're going to aim at. Hey, can we find other people who will purchase these goods that we are now producing at a very rapid rate? Okay, so that is the first driving factor, needing people to buy our stuff. Okay, the second thing is we would also like to get some raw materials from these countries. So for example, Hawaii had a lot of sugar plantations and we were interested in acquiring that sugar so we wouldn't, well, actually the businesses were interested in selling it and not having to pay tariffs. But in any case, you're wanting these raw materials that can then be utilized to make other goods. And then the other piece of this is that if we're going to trade with these countries, we need bases for the ships to refuel and for the military to protect those trade ships. Okay, so if you look down here, you can see these, picking up these islands is very intentional. Look, it's a path to China. You have Hawaii, Midway, Wake Island, Guam, Philippines, boom, you made it, right? So these are all islands where you could refuel your ship, and also you could build a military base to protect those ships that are doing the trading. Okay, this is a larger picture of that map. You can see that more clearly, the path to China. Okay, now in addition to this economic motive, there are also ideologies that are prevalent during this period that help promote imperialism as well. So social Darwinism is one of these ideas. We didn't talk about that as much this year, but social Darwinism is essentially this idea of survival of the fittest that you study in science, and we're applying it to society. Okay, so if you take social Darwinism to its extreme, you're essentially saying humans are just like animals. We're all in a massive struggle to survive. If you survive and do well, that means you are fit. If you don't, that means you are unfit. So during the industrial period, 5-year-old kid loses her hand in the factory. What that means is she's unfit, right? So it's not exactly a humanitarian ideology. Now, this ideology, though, can be applied to countries. And what it would suggest is that the US is a superior country. And therefore, if you can, you have the right to invade and occupy weaker countries, right? So all the countries are just in a massive struggle to survive. Whoever comes out on top, that's all just part of social Darwinism. I mean, you can see that kind of depicted in this little cartoon, right? The United States is all bulked up and ready to go be a superior country. Okay, the third idea, or the second idea, third motive, is called the white man's burden. This term was used by a man named Rudyard Kipling, and it refers to this responsibility, felt responsibility to share technology, civilization, and religion with other nations. Okay, now, the white man's burden kind of has two sides to one coin. So there is a piece of the white man's burden that is humanitarian. And probably the best modern example I can think of is the Thirst Project that has been going on at Downey High School, right? So the Thirst Project is about solving the water crisis globally, trying to make potable water that's clean available to areas that don't have it. And that's awesome, right? The school raises money every year. We want to build wells for people who don't have it. And that is about the Western world having more resources that we're saying, yes, we want to help other people who don't have these resources, right? So that's a part of this moral responsibility to share technology, and it can be very humanitarian. On the other hand, it can be kind of paternalistic. So you can come in and be like, I'm here to solve your problem because I'm better than you, right? And you can come in and say, our religion is the best one and you need to convert to it. So your culture doesn't matter. You can also come in and say that that other place is less, quote unquote, civilized, or like they need to become like you have the moral authority because you're more advanced technologically. Okay, so you can see that side, it's kind of the dark side of the white man's burden depicted in this cartoon, where you have these white people, you can see Uncle Sam here, carrying other minority groups like from Asia and Africa in these baskets. And you can see the criticism here, right? They're like, no, actually, you're being brutal, and we still have slavery, or we're enslaving the people. I'm sorry, we have slavery at home, but we're enslaving the people that we're working with. And you can see how even this guy is depicted almost like a monkey. It's a way of saying, like, you're less. Right. And so there can be a moral superiority behind that. Okay. So regardless of how we're thinking about this, whether there's a humanitarian element or it's also this superiority complex, it is leading to missionary movements, and it's also leading to development, right? People that are going and trying to develop these countries. Okay. Last piece is called the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, because that's a mouthful. So the Monroe Doctrine came out back in 1824. This is when the United States tried to say to the world, hey, the Western Hemisphere is ours. Okay, so the United States told Europe, don't come over here. Like, you guys can make colonies wherever you want, but don't build any more colonies in the Western Hemisphere. That means in Latin America and South America. At the time, Europe basically ignored this because they were like, whatever, man, you guys don't have a military to back that up. when Teddy Roosevelt comes in, at this point, the United States is building a Navy, and he's like, hey guys, we got a Navy now. We have money now. Seriously, stay on your side. And this was partially a reaction to Europe having already carved up Africa. The United States was trying to compete with Europe. And so we were essentially saying, this is our area. Okay, the result of all of these motives is that the United States during this period is going to significantly increase their influence in both Asia and Latin America. Okay, so here you have your global map. Let's look at, this is the Western Hemisphere right here. Okay, so what the United States says is, hey, Europe, stay over here. Take your colonies on this side. Don't come over here. This is our purview. Okay, so the last thing that we want to talk about here is a few major events in this increasing influence in Asia and then the increasing influence in Latin America. So in 1898, this is under President McKinley, right before Teddy Roosevelt. There are a couple things that happen. So the U.S. annexes Hawaii under President McKinley, and the United States goes to war with Spain in the Spanish-American War. Teddy Roosevelt was in the military at this point, or in charge of the military, and he declared this the splendid little war. It's only 4 months long. So for the United States to beat Spain in a war in 4 months was a pretty solid statement about where the United States was in relation to other European countries, right? This is where the United States is stepping on the stage as, hey, we are a full industrial power with a serious military and don't mess with us, right? That's part of the message that comes out of the Spanish-American War. Okay, what happens at the end of the war, though, is we're going to pick up some territory. So we pick up Puerto Rico, which the United States still has as a territory. There are still ongoing conversations about Puerto Rican statehood, if they should be added as a state. Right now, they're just a territory. And then we also pick up Guam, which we still have, also as a territory, and the Philippines, which we paid $20 million for. The Philippines have been independent since after World War II, but they are going to be a U.S. territory for a while. Now, let's look at why we care about this. Okay, so look at these maps at the bottom. Let's look at this one on the left. So you can see where Puerto Rico is, right? This is closer to kind of close to Florida over here. But these are the ones that we really want. Guam and the Philippines are two stepping stones to which country? That's right. Ding, ding, ding. China, right? That's where we're trying to get to. And that was the purpose of picking up those territories. Okay, Hawaii is another stepping stone on the way, right? So you're getting a pretty solid stepping stone over to trade with China out of this. So it's not surprising that in 1899 to 1900, the United States tries to open up more trade with China through a policy called the open door policy. You may have talked about this a little bit in World. Essentially, the open door policy establishes that China is willing to freely trade with all European countries and the United States. So up until this point, European countries had carved out spheres of influence. You can see that on this map. So there's like British, French, Russian, they're all trying to carve out these territories where they mostly have trade. And the US basically comes in and says, how about an open door? How about everybody gets to trade everywhere? And what's kind of interesting about this is they didn't actually work it out with China. They worked it out with all these other European countries. Okay, but the goal was for the United States to now have a market to sell now that we have the stepping stones on the way to China where we actually have the capacity to do that. Okay, so again, here we go. This is right, California over here. We have Hawaii, Guam is over here, and then the Philippines and China. Okay, now, as I mentioned before, the other place where we're increasing influence is in Latin America. So not just in Asia, but also in Latin America because of the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. During this period, we're going to increase monetary investment. That means we're going to pour money into Latin America and business investment. And we are also going to become more actively involved with the military. We're going to intervene in Latin America more often. The prime example that we have of this is the Panama Canal in 1903. So Teddy Roosevelt is the president. He wants a canal to help facilitate trade. So again, this is about trade and the economy. So come over here. This is where Panama is currently, the canal. Okay, so previously, if you wanted to, say, ship goods from one side of the United States to the other one, you would have to go all the way down around the Cape of South America, right? So you have to come here and you go all the way down here, die, right? This is very dangerous down here, and then come up the other side. And so somebody comes up with this brilliant idea to cut a path through Panama right here. Okay, now here's the thing. Panama didn't actually exist at this time. It was a territory in Colombia. So this is part of the country of Colombia. It wasn't his own country. And so Teddy Roosevelt approached Colombia and he said, hey, can we build a canal? And Colombia said no. So this is number one. Colombia refused the offer. So the U.S. went to Panama, this territory in Colombia, and said, hey, do you guys want to be independent? Are you interested in having a revolution? And the Panamanians were like, yeah, sure. And so the U.S. supported this Panamanian revolution. Panama became its own country, and then they let the United States build a canal. Okay, so this is just you can see the United States increasing its role in the world and stepping in and intervening in other countries' affairs in kind of a new way in this situation. The canal is going to be built between 1904 and 1914. It takes 10 years to build this thing. And the United States no longer possesses control of the canal. It's been returned to Panama since Carter's term in the 70s. Okay, but this is a crazy thing that gets established. And by 1914, that means it's just in time for World War I, right? So if you want to move your ships between oceans, you can more easily do that now by the time World War I begins. Okay, but all of this is just demonstrating, look, the United States were taking this more active role and we're willing to use the military and we're willing to intervene in Latin America and South America. Okay, now the last thing we want to mention that's also in the time period is increasing competition amongst nations and growing nationalism is what's going to get the world into World War I, right? And so this breaks out between 1914 and 1918. The U.S. joins late in 1917. But last year you studied this. Remember, these are the alliances that get set up. And this is all part of European imperialism. Okay, so World War I is really an imperialistic war that's set during this context of growing international imperialism. And that is what you're going to look at later this week. Okay, so here's our quick recap. Major highlights of imperialism. Number one, surplus goods after industrialization led the United States to search for international markets to sell to, aka China, right? You can see that over here. Please buy our stuff. Okay, two, increasing trade with China meant the United States needed to acquire islands for refueling stations and naval bases, hence annexing Hawaii, Guam and the Philippines at the end of the Spanish-American War. Number three, as Europe competes for colonies, the U.S. reasserts its claim over the Western Hemisphere through the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which leads to an increasing role in Latin America. You can see that in this cartoon, right? Here's the United States standing on top of the Western Hemisphere, like, hey, Europe, stay over there. Okay, and then lastly, European conflict leads to alliances, which then explode into World War I. And that's what we will look at later this week. Thanks for hanging out with us today on our Downey High School's online history class. Have a great day, guys.